So one of the methods is using pre-written HTML with display control, and the other one is dynamically creating content with JavaScript. So I'm going to open up my code editor so I can actually show you how both of these work in my code editor, and then I'll give you a little bit more information. So I'm going to show you pre-written first. Let me just zoom in here. So pre-written is, we have our HTML file, we have our head, so you're not going to see anything inside of this head on our website. The stuff you're actually going to see on the website lives within the body. And so inside this website, we have a navigation bar. You can see by the nav element, and the navigation bar has two buttons. We have a home button, which is going to display the word home, and we have an about button, which is going to display the word about. Now, there's also an attribute on each one of these elements, and the attribute is an on-click. So when you click this button, this function is going to execute, and when you click the about function or button, the show about is going to execute. Now, you can see we have our home page and we have our about page. They're both being shown on the page. They're both there. So when we land on this website, the home page is going to be shown. You're going to see a header that says home page, and you're going to see a paragraph that says welcome to the home page. This is also going to be there. So the about page is going to be present, but as you can see, there's an attribute called style, and its display is set to none. So it's going to be there. It exists when like Google web crawlers crawl the website. It's going to know, like, it's going to be able to pick up this information, but users who are viewing the website aren't going to see it. And so the way that we're actually going to get this about page to show up in the browser is by clicking this about button, which is going to execute the show about function. It'll show us this, and it'll make this one disappear. And the way that it does that is we have two functions here. One is called show home, one is called show about. And so let's just say we land on this page, and I'm going to show you in the web browser too in just a minute, so don't worry, I'm actually going to show you what it looks like, and we're going to play around with it. But let's just say we land on the website, the home page is showing, this one is hidden, and we're like, how do we see the about page? We click the about button. When we click the about button, on the click of the about button, we run the show about function. And so when this show about function runs, we're going to use a method that's built into the browser. All browsers have this method built into them. Document.getElementById. So we're looking for an element whose ID is homepage. Now, if you look at our HTML, the homepage content has the ID of homepage. So we're targeting this div right here and everything within it, basically. But specifically, we're targeting this div. And so we're changing that div. We're changing the style, and specifically the display of the style, to none. So we're basically taking the style that exists on this one here, and we're adding it to this one. So this one will go from being seen to not being seen. And then we're doing the same thing. We're using a built-in method called getElementById. We're targeting the element with the ID about page. And if you go back here, you can see this div has an ID called about page. So that's the element we're targeting. We're going to set the style and specifically the display to block. So this is actually going to show it. And then the other function is the same exact thing, except you're showing home. So you're targeting the element with the ID that says home page. So this one here. And you're changing the display to block. So you're making it visible. And you're taking the element with the ID about page. So here, or this div, more importantly, and you are setting its display to none. And so let me go ahead and just pull this into the browser really quickly so you all can see what this looks like. I'm just going to slide this HTML file into the browser. Browsers will render HTML files. And so we have home and about. And when I click about, we're not seeing the about page. And I'm going to ask you guys why. Someone, I know one of you know, but let me ask you why. Exactly. We have this pre-written HTML file and we have this pre-written JS file, but they're just separate files right now. We need to connect them. How does the HTML know that when I click this button to run this function? Right now, this name exists in the HTML file, but the functionality is somewhere else. How does this file know that there's specific functionality I need to use? And Aditya was right. We need to import this JavaScript code into our HTML file. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to use an element called source. Script with source. And I'm going to pass in the pre-written JS. So to inject JavaScript into your HTML, you're using a script element. You're using the source attribute, and the value of the source attribute is the name of the file. And I just use the / because it's in the same directory. All these files are in the one basic rendering directory. Since they're all in that directory, then I just use .forward. If I was a directory up, I would use .forward. But we'll get to more stuff like that. So now the JS is connected. So let's go back to this, refresh it, and now when I click about, you can see it changing.
Hey Jim, just a quick question.
Yes.
When you do press the buttons, does it take you to a different page or the same page?
Same page.
But there's two, isn't there two, like, then what changed? I mean, it just seems like you can just press buttons, you know?
Yeah, so the only thing that changed is this display, the style on the elements. So like when you see this home element, when you see like home page, welcome to the home page, when you see this, this element is still there. Like, let's go ahead and pull open inspect. Yeah, let's pull open inspect. And let's look at elements. If we go to body, you see our home page. So our home page is here. And this is also here. Our about page is there. It's just, it's not being displayed. But the content still lives there.
Oh, so it's not like, for example, if we were to see this as actual paper, right? We're only on first paper with the home page. When you click on about, we're on another page, same format. So there's just two pages created.
Yeah, if you were doing it on a piece of paper, it would be like if home page was written on a piece of paper, it would be like using whiteout on home page and then writing about page over it and then doing the same thing just over and over. So it's like still there, but you just can't see it.
Okay.
Yeah, the only thing that's changing is this style property right here. So if we go to about, look at these. Watch these flash when I click it. So if I click on home, they flash. If I click on about, they flash.
And you couldn't do that without JS, right? Like you couldn't have that functionality without JS.
Yeah, that's JavaScript right there. To change them. Yep.
So cool.
So that is using pre-written HTML with display control. So we're just writing all the HTML that we actually need, and we're choosing what HTML to display based on the JavaScript function that the button executes. The second method is dynamically creating content with JavaScript. So this one is a little more challenging, especially for people who are newer, but don't worry, it's a very simple example, so it shouldn't go over anyone's head. Let me close out of these here. So I have here, this is a different HTML file. Let me go ahead and just drag this one in here. And so you can see that I have home and about, same thing. I have those buttons, right? We have the navigation and I have the buttons. I have the home button and I have the about button. And in the home button, we have show home. In the about button, we have show about. And so instead of actually pre-writing all of the content into the HTML, we just create a div. We create a div with an ID that says content. In this div, it could be home, it could be about, it could be contact, it could be anything. But this is what's actually going to be changing. And so if we go ahead and look at the JavaScript, you can see that we still have our show home function. We have our show about function. Now, there's a little bit difference though. So instead of putting this HTML in the HTML file, the way that we did in pre-written HTML, see that div h1 and p, we just put it in the JavaScript. So we have our h1 and our p, that's in the JavaScript. The only thing that's in the HTML is the div. So the div is the same and wraps an h1 or a p regardless of whether we're loading up the home page or the about page. So in the dynamic.js, what we're doing is same thing or similar thing. We're targeting an element. This time we're targeting the content element. So if we go back to the HTML, this is the element with the ID content. So this is the element that we're targeting and we're going to be able to manipulate and make modifications to with JavaScript. And so we use this variable content div, and then we just run content div dot inner HTML. So you're actually basically injecting HTML into that div element. So you see this div element. It doesn't look like there's anything inside of it, but when you run this function is injecting this HTML into the content div. Because you're taking the object, the content div, and you're changing its inner HTML property. Right now, the way that we're looking at it, it's not loading. We don't see a home page and we don't see an about page. So neither of these functions are actually executing right now, which is a problem. Because when we get to this dynamic HTML page, we don't want nothing to load. We want something to load. What do we want to load? Like, what's the first thing that we should see when we land on this page?
Home page.
Home page, exactly. So what's the problem with this JavaScript file right here? We have the functions.
There's no initialization.
Exactly. So to start with the home page, we need to actually execute this function. So, boom. Now we're executing this function. Once you land on the page, the browser is going to process this function, store it in its memory, process this function, store it in its memory. It's going to be like, oh, in initialization, you're actually executing a function. It's going to execute this function, and so it should execute this function. It should target the div that is empty when we get to the page, and then it should inject that div with the HTML, the home page HTML.
I have a question.
Yes.
So, let's say you don't do that show home function, you don't call that function.
Mhm.
But when you have this UI, like let's say initially you won't see anything, but once you land on the page, you don't see anything, and when you click, then the function should get called. Right?
Mm-hmm.
Like you don't call the show home, you don't initialize it,
Mm-hmm.
and then you land. But then when you click, it should exactly call the function.
Yeah, so we don't execute, we come here and it should show.
Yeah, it should show, right? Because they are calling the functions.
Yes. Now we're here and we're pressing the buttons, but it's not showing anything. Why? Exactly. Exactly.
Okay.
So now we have our dynamic JS injected into our HTML. They're connected. If I reload this, it'll load up home. It'll load up about. So they're both there. The problem is now when we first render the page, there's nothing here. So like Angel said, we want this function to execute when we land on the page no matter what, because we want to land on the home page. And so now when I do this, we land on the home page, and then we can change it.
I have a quick question.
Yes.
Why was there two different JSs?
Are you talking about this one and this one?
Yeah, why do you have two and why do you have two HTML.html?
So these are just two different methods. So one pre-written is the first one. It's the one where we're basically like building all of our HTML into the HTML page, into the HTML document, and then we're using JavaScript to just change the style of the documents so that one is always showing. So this content is always going to be on the HTML document. Whereas with this one here, there's no content that's always on the HTML document except for the navigation. That's always there. But this content, it's not always there. That content is determined by JavaScript. So JavaScript is rendering the HTML and injecting it into the HTML document.
So if you deleted the prewritten.html and the prewritten.js, the website wouldn't work?
Dynamic HTML and dynamic JS would work because those are two totally different files.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So, it would work, but the other prewritten.js, prewritten.html won't work. Like, say for example, you just go and delete prewritten.html and prewritten.js. Will you delete the whole? Will it not work?
Let's see. So that's actually a really good question. If I delete them from this directory right here,
Yeah.
yeah. HTML wouldn't work unless pre-written is in the same directory as pre-written HTML. If pre-written JS is not in the same directory as pre-written HTML, it won't work.
Yeah, it's just
Because
I'm a little confused because I've never seen it like this, where it's like you have, for example, let's make these two different resumes, right?
Mhm.
Pre-written is one resume, dynamic is another resume. But like, if we're applying for the same job, why do we have two different resumes?
Because, well, I guess I'm answering your question because you want the way that they function to be differently. So like if you're applying for finance jobs, you want a resume that's built with like finance experience and that sort of thing.
But we need both of the resumes there for the job.
Can I try to see if
Like
I'm
I understand why we have HTML.
Yeah.
I understand why we have an HTML
For
and a JS.
Yes.
Document. I understand, but like I've never seen 4 documents like.
Oh, okay. Yeah. So I just have them in the same directory just to make them easy to navigate. But if we were building this project, which we are going to be building this project, we're either going to use the pre-written method or we're going to use the dynamic method. And so, yeah, these are two different projects basically. Pre-written is one project, dynamic is another project. Just keep it, try to think about it like that. These are just two different methods of working with HTML and JavaScript. So the pre-written is where the HTML is pre-written into the HTML. The dynamic is where the HTML is dynamically rendered by JavaScript. So just two totally different methods.
Right, and just another really quick question. I noticed you don't have a .css.
Yes.
Is that on purpose?
Yeah, because CSS has nothing to do with this topic at all.
Okay, sorry.
Yeah, nah, you're good. Good questions. All right. So I do want to talk about using pre-written HTML with display control versus dynamically creating content with JavaScript. Like, what are the pros and cons? When do you use one over the other? And so when we're talking about using pre-written HTML with display control, the pros are simplicity. It's super simple. Look, we just write all the HTML, and then our JavaScript functions is just like, display this, don't display that. It's very simple. The content is indexed by search engines. So when Google web crawlers are crawling your website, they see all the content that the website is about. And that's better for SEO. So they're going to be able to see that content, and it's going to make it more likely that your website shows up, essentially, because you're providing more information to the web crawlers. And reliability. The content is always present. It's always there. It's always on the HTML document. And changing between content on the HTML document is very simple. It's just show this, don't show this. Don't show that, show this. It's super simple. Cons is the initial load time. So the increase initial page size. So the initial page size is much higher. So imagine we have a home page, an about page, a features page, a volunteer page, a contact page, and we have all these pages. Let's just say we have like 100 different pages that you can navigate to. That's just a lot. That's a lot compared to if you did it with this method. It's only one of these that are loading initially, so it's much smaller. Scalability issues. It becomes very cumbersome if you're trying to build all of the HTML into the document. You're going to see, because we're actually going to start with this method, because this one feature that we're working on is simple enough to just start with this method. But then very quickly, people are going to start getting frustrated. They're going to be like, this is hard to manage. And then we're going to switch over to the dynamically creating the content with JavaScript. So you could see, like, why do we dynamically create content with JavaScript? Why are we shifting over to this method? You're going to clearly see the reason why. And that's purposeful. I want you all to see the reason why. And it's just less dynamic. It's bad for generating content based on user actions or from data from external sources. So if you know everything that you want to show up on the website, then this is okay, because you could just pre-code it all into your HTML. But if you're pulling from an external source, or you need the content to be dynamic where you just don't know what it's going to be before the page loads, this just doesn't work. This method doesn't work. This method only works for static websites where you know exactly what the content is going to be before you do it. Like documentation, for example, you know? And then for dynamically creating content with JavaScript, the pros are less initial load. Initial load is lighter, less HTML. You're only loading what needs to be loaded. Flexibility allows dynamic content in external sources, so you could actually pull from like external APIs or somewhere else, or if you have to do calculations to figure out what the HTML looks like, you do that and then you render the HTML. So there's way more flexibility, way more power, way more control, way more creativity. Like, there's just so many more options with JavaScript. And scalability, it's better for large or unknown data. And then the cons is dependency on JavaScript, which I don't really think is a con, but it could be considered a con, especially if you're building a website for it's like a global site where there's certain parts of the world that aren't using JavaScript, or which is becoming much less rare, but I hear it's still an issue sometimes. There's a potential delay. So while the rendered or fetched from external source, like while the browser is reaching out to some external API like NFL stats or Pokemon data or whatever you're pulling from an external source, you're waiting for that server to respond with the data. You're waiting for the browser to get the data. When the browser gets the data, then it could render the HTML. And so there's a little delay there as far as like network latency. And then SEO considerations. Sometimes it's not indexed. Like with this method here, all the HTML is here. The web crawlers are able to see everything that exists. Whereas with this, it's not so. Though, times are changing. Web crawlers are becoming a lot better. So that's not as much of an issue either. These cons right here, they're becoming much, much less of an issue. So you can start seeing how the pros are heavy and the cons are light here. And the pros are light here and the cons are heavy here. So this is definitely where we want to be shifting sooner than later. And then there's some other methods. I'm not going to actually go into these in detail, but I want you to start thinking about these. The only reason I'm only starting with these two is because this is Introduction to Web Development Bootcamp. But on the next phase, when we start getting into React or Angular, the frameworks, TypeScript, design patterns, all that stuff, then we're going to be thinking a lot more about these. And so I'm going to zoom in and just browse over them really quickly so you could pause for each one on them. I'm not going to go into detail, but we have server-side rendering with the popularity of like Next and Nuxt. This is becoming huge. Static site generation, client-side routing, which is good for like administrative or things, or like if SEO isn't important. AJAX calls, which is kind of outdated, but frameworks are basically handling this stuff now. Web components and iframes, which is less popular as far as like building a whole website with them, but more popular for external APIs like YouTube videos or maps and that sort of thing. So yeah, when I post a YouTube video of this training, feel free to just pause and read the details of these, but they're kind of going deeper in those. Is just outside the scope of this here.